I'll also start by paying my respect to the traditional owners of the land which we're on. It'll be different for all of us. In my case, it's the Camaragal people. I think I need to just say that whilst I am going to talk about trauma and comorbidity, I can't really say that I'm going to offer great expertise in relation to the management of refugees, since it's not an area that's I have a lot of experience in. And if anything, I would be deferring to my colleagues at STARTS in relation to that specific matter. Nevertheless, I will try and give you a view of the changing landscape diagnostically that I think one can observe over a long period, and the increasing prominence given to the role of trauma, and also try to give you an idea of perhaps an overarching aspect of treatment in relation to language and the creation of stories. Let's see. I might have to, slides are not progressing, so I might just have to go in and out again. Hold on. All right. So I imagine all of you would recognize Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You might ask what he's doing in a talk like this. One of the things he's famous for, a famous quote, is that the only thing to fear is fear itself. And in that quote, we see a reference to fear or terror, central, I guess, to the experience of trauma. Most of you would also be aware that F.D. Roosevelt was stricken by polio and became paralyzed in middle age, around the age of 39, I think. One of the things he did in response to that was to set up a polio rehabilitation clinic in America. And I guess one of the points I'm making here is that leadership, I think, is important in relation to trauma. I also came across this when I was researching my book. And toward the end of the Second World War, Roosevelt said, if civilization is to survive, we must cultivate the science of human relationships, the ability of all peoples of all kinds to live together in the same world at peace. You might reflect for a moment on how we're doing in that project. Not necessarily all that well, I would say. But nevertheless, I think it's an important idea. Science of human relationships, psychiatry and mental health science in general, it's not really such a straightforward matter. And one of the things that I would be suggesting, and that I think is explored in this book, which I've written and recently published, is the role of language. And when I talk about, most people, when they think about language, you think about words and symbols, something a bit abstract in a way. But of course, language is spoken and it's used in exchanges we have with each other. It's actually something that's living, but unlike other living things, the life isn't confined to specific individuals. Indeed, the life of language and the exchanges we make with language occur socially, occur in community. They also occur internally within each of us. But this kind of idea of language that I'm promoting, one might say, is thinking of language almost as a kind of biology, and stories might be thought of in a similar way. As I said, when we look at relationships, mental experience, mental life in general, and trauma for that matter, it's not necessarily all that easy to be totally objective about these things. I mean, our own experience is a mixture of the objective and the subjective. It's feeling involved. And yet the objective perspective undoubtedly is considered the hallmark of the scientific perspective. When we take the psychological perspective, however, we're talking about meaning and value. Humans respond to the sense of significance they have, even if they're not sure exactly what things mean. And we all integrate our experience as we go along in life. This is an ongoing matter. It's not something that is a sort of task that we consciously set about, but it's a task that can be interfered with by trauma. Of course, in the history of psychiatric classification, the DSM in particular self-consciously moved away from any definition of disorder in terms of etiology. So it moved towards a value-free definition in terms of symptoms and behaviours in an attempt to be objective and more scientific. And this, I think we should see the value in this as well. I mean, if one looks at diseases and how their attitudes to disease and illness in the community, this objective view has had a great value, I think, in helping us move away from seeing illness as a kind of moral failing or weakness or due to malign spirits, malign external factors. So I wouldn't want to understate the importance of that. I think it's extremely important. However, it doesn't capture entirely the reality of mental life. Of course, if something isn't included in a system of classification, what tends to happen is that practitioners will find something that is in the system, that is represented. And so sometimes things get left out. And for a long while, that was the case with trauma. Trauma, of course, is an inherently meaningful term in relation to the individual and the environment, particularly in relation to the interpersonal environment. And as such, I think it inherently implies a story. These three wise monkeys, you'll all be familiar with. So, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Again, in my net surfing for this talk, I came across the origin is said to be that this is originally comes from Confucius and was a parable that related to finding a way of living well and avoiding evil. So there was a kind of benign intent to it, one might say. However, I think there is an issue which is still with us of trauma blindness. This quote from Paul Kamel, I think, illustrates the point. We do use strategy. See, he refers to the metaphorical strategies clinics use to understand and relate to these unassimilable, difficult experiences. We medicalize, technologize, or scientize them. But that doesn't necessarily constitute psychological understanding. And I'm sure we'd all subscribe to the fact that psychological understanding is important to healing. But it is kind of natural to avoid trauma if we can, of course. And for me, even the nightly news sometimes can be a bit much, or I find myself having to distract myself with other things. So there's a natural tendency to avoidance. It involves often looking the other way. And the three monkeys who I showed you before might be sort of found guilty of doing that, of not recognizing what's really happening in the world. This may lead to failures of recognition and resonance, and that failure of response is a central part, I think, of understanding the suffering of people who have suffered trauma. Of course, we can also be put off by the fact that we may not feel we can fix trauma. And indeed, I don't think we can actually. You can't undo what has happened. However, we can help people towards healing and towards regaining a meaningful path in life. We don't have to blind ourselves to what's going on. Of course, in therapy, we all would be aware of vehement emotions that sometimes make it difficult to speak, let alone respond. Of course, if we look at the experience of people who are presenting, that's often central to their experience as well. We can also be often, I think, overcome by the scale of the problem, because we're certainly talking about something that affects a very large proportion of the population in a very significant way. And in perhaps more minor ways, it probably affects everyone. This is a thumbnail sketch, my thumbnail sketch of the last 130 years or so in relation to trauma and its recognition within psychiatry. So you would all be aware, I think, of Freud originally having a theory of child seduction, which essentially was related to childhood sexual abuse and was a trauma theory. But famously, he recanted this in favor of a model of unconscious fantasy and drive as the primary motivators, making an intrapsychic model, which always kind of pins responsibility on the individual, in fact. So it kind of does play quite an important role in shifting the attention away from actual experience, if you like. Of course, at the time of Freud, Pierre Janet was almost an equally famous figure, and his contemporaneous theory of trauma-related dissociation is one that has come back into favor, and trauma, of course, and dissociation are very closely linked. It's not over the years that the general public haven't been aware of the relation between trauma and mental disorder. Of course, in World War I, what we now call PTSD was known as shell shock, a popular term that had a lot of airplay and made a lot of sense to a lot of people, including a lot of doctors and other clinicians. Similarly, in the Second World War, the term that became popular at the time was combat fatigue, but neither of these terms were officially recognized. If you've ever been to a talk by Bessel van der Kolk, he makes the point that the major textbook of psychiatry, Kaplan and Sadek, in its 1970 iteration, largely overlooked the problem of incest, which was seen as extremely rare at that time. It wasn't until 1980 that PTSD came into the DSM classification. That's a long time that it wasn't recognized. Of course, Judith Herman's landmark book, Trauma and Recovery, and her work generally was very influential in raising awareness about the influence of trauma, and not only in the form of PTSD, but also in relation to early trauma. And over the last few decades, I think intersubjective and interpersonal relation perspectives, which give some weight to the reality of interpersonal experience to a greater extent than the original drive theories did, has made a difference. We've had the Royal Commission fairly recently, and there are a lot of consumer voices, the Blue Knot Foundation, specifically in relation to childhood sexual abuse, but a lot of the groups in our community at the moment, the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too, a lot of the groups are speaking loudly about the suffering that they see often as a result not only of individual acts, but of cultural attitudes. And indeed, trauma is a problem for all of us, not simply for individuals. one might ask the question, well, why was PTSD resisted for so long as a diagnosis? Of course, within military culture, often mental disorder was seen as weakness. Leaders of the military always had the priority of getting soldiers back to the front. Of course, one should bear in mind that a century ago in the First World War, deserters would be shot. So there were very punitive attitudes to people that didn't toe the line, so to speak, and there would have been a lot of incentive for people to hide symptoms even when they had them. Of course, there were many people that had more enlightened views and worked very hard to help people that did suffer war traumas. And of course, as we would now think of it, PTSD applies far beyond the military, but of course, that's where it first became recognised, one might say. The argument was used for a long time that there were other things that accounted for presentations. People had personality disorders or comorbidities, which is the subject for the day to some extent. So that could be seen as providing an alternative to the PTSD diagnosis. Although the clinical patterns that have been recognised are pretty compelling when it comes down. Perhaps there was a preference in identifying problems with the individual, inherent in classification systems, certainly at the time. And that may give the sense of things being more controllable. On the other hand, I think it involves denial of the role we all have in this. And of course, there would have been concerns about cost and liability. And indeed, there are a lot of issues around costs and liability that still exercise people's minds in the courts today. The 2013 iteration of DSM, DSM-5, is the first to have a whole chapter related to trauma and stress-related disorders. So since that first PTSD diagnosis in 1980, things have changed a fair bit. This is the list of disorders that are there. The criteria for PTSD still does involve a kind of extreme exposure experience, although that can be witnessing that now as well as being directly involved. But it still doesn't really cover ongoing relational and early developmental trauma, one might note. Despite the fact that some of these trauma-related disorders are disorders of childhood, in fact. The disorders on either side of the chapter on trauma and the stress-related disorders are the anxiety disorders and the dissociative disorders on either side. And both of them, it is recognised in DSM, have a strong link to trauma. There's a lot of evidence for borderline personality disorder, and I think really other PD diagnoses as often having an important basis in developmental trauma. And of course, substance abuse disorders, eating disorders, depressive disorders. This isn't emphasised in DSM-5, although there is this line that I've included there, which refers to adverse childhood experiences as a certain potent risk factors for major depression. I think particularly one might find that more often in treatment-resistant depression as well. And of course, there's a large literature on psychotic disorders having a relation to trauma as well, although it's still not universally accepted, one would say. The message for me is that trauma relates to most mental disorder, in fact. One of the changes in DSM is the linking of, or the inclusion of PTSD with dissociative symptoms, specifically the dissociative subtype. And this is important insofar as that there is evidence that this does have a stronger association with early trauma, although that's not really in the DSM yet. What's meant by dissociation in this classification is depersonalization and derealization I'll come back to that, but that's a fairly limited range of definitions of dissociative phenomena, which really extend far beyond that. And of course, we're just getting to the point where complex post-traumatic stress disorder is going to officially become a diagnosis. It is in the ICD-11, but as you can see, it comes into effect early next year. Again, I just point out that the definition here of exposure is event or series of events of an extreme or prolonged and repetitive nature, extremely threatening, things like torture, slavery, genocide, prolonged domestic violence, repeated childhood sexual and physical abuse. Well, no one would disagree with those things, but to some extent, it's not really including the categories like disorganized attachment and disturbances, significant disturbances of attachment that I think probably form the majority, in fact, of cases that could be considered under this classification. So just to remind you of current definitions, they are actually rather broad. So a disruption or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, the mental functions that are listed there, that can disrupt every area of psychological functioning. That's a very broad definition in DSM, and it's pretty similar in ICD. So we're talking about something that disrupts us, that doesn't allow us to keep integrating as we go along in life. So there's a loss of our sense of personal meaning, our sense of coherence and continuity. Lives have a sense of being chopped up. And of course, that there's not much of a story going on when that happens. We lose our narrative, one might say. And you can see when I talk in that way, what I mean when we might think of stories in a way as a biological phenomenon. When we're dissociated, we're not entirely present to the environment. We've lost our highest level of functioning. I think that's quite nicely depicted in this. That's one of the problems with dissociation. We're dealing with something that isn't there in a way. We're dealing with a negative. So we need to think of what the positive is that is failing under circumstances of dissociation. I think you've all, or many of you will have heard Stephen Porges talk, and his polyvagal theory tells us that we've evolved towards social engagement. Our bodies are constructed towards social engagement. When we're functioning at our best, when we're in a position for self to grow, we will be engaged. Others help us regulate ourselves, not only as infants, but throughout life. So being present to others, being able to engage socially is extremely important. And since Pierre Janet, that's been understood. He referred to présentification as reflecting a high level of consciousness, a higher level, and we can fall down the hierarchy from that level. Language is also required for us to function at our best. Language becomes our second nature as we acquire it. Of course, there's a first language. The first language is the language of feeling and emotional expression. And we shouldn't underestimate that. There's complex communications that go on between mother and infant before the infant acquires language. Other species have complex social networks that are based upon affective communication rather than symbolic communication. Once we acquire the mother tongue, however, we then need to integrate our felt experience with the concepts that we acquire, and the capacity to speak with a sense of conviction and believing in what we say, and indeed the motivation to speak at all are kind of effective qualities, if you like, an effective part of language. And again, you might sort of get a flavor for what I mean by language as a biological phenomenon. So these things are failing in dissociation, and primary dissociation is strongly linked to trauma. So we think of trauma and dissociation. This is the experience of fragmentation or a sense of disintegration. We're no longer there as a self isn't there. We're not the same person. This kind of experience is pretty toxic and generally fairly short-lived. It's resolved by a physiological strategy, which is autonomically mediated, that is unconsciously mediated, not done by an act of will, but it's resolved towards either hypo or hyper arousal. And this is what we mean by secondary dissociation. It arises out of primary dissociation. The sequestration of a complex of psychic life that now occurs, a compartmentalization, either by inhibitory mechanisms that reduce the higher arousal characteristic of primary dissociation. So that's the kind of dissociation that DSM was recognizing in the PTSD with dissociation, the state change, or there are positive symptoms, which refers to the re-experiencing symptoms, intrusive symptoms, conversion disorders, fugue states, things like that would be considered in that group. And these things keep happening, of course, for many people, often because they're continually or repeatedly being exposed to trauma. So we get things being established and kind of a reorganization of the mind and of the brain, which might be understood as tertiary dissociation. And people refer to this sometimes as structural dissociation. Despite the fact that the concept of dissociation has been around for a long time and most people would agree it's a pretty important concept, it's not that easy to demonstrate physiologically. I mean, we do invoke changes to different states, reductions from a high level of functioning, things which we'd expect might show in some way. Our group has been involved in some research in this area in relation to borderline patients. And the P3 complex is one which, when you provide, under experimental conditions, people are given stimuli, auditory or other stimuli. In our case, it was auditory. But the capacity to respond to the stimulus is demonstrated on the evoked response potential. And we see this response, which involves two components, the P3A and P3B. The P3A seems to relate to the immediate disposition of attention. It's an orienting kind of response. The P3B relates more to the capacity to sustain attention. With normal patients, control group, the two are fused, so it looks like one peak. But in borderline patients, and these were unmedicated borderline patients, there's a distinct difference, and you can see two peaks. It's not shown on this graph, but what we see in the borderline group is a very high deflection of the P3A component. And with repeated presentation of stimuli, it remains high, which suggests, and also the P3B is actually below the control group. So it suggests that there's a failure of habituation. And this might be a marker, we think, for, one might say, a tendency towards disintegration. If one can't get accustomed to stimuli, one is going to be more susceptible to being disrupted. I mentioned the importance of consumer groups in shaping health policy, and groups like STARTS, I think, are particularly responsive to the community in this kind of way. But generally, when you hear consumers talk, they want more than just recognition of symptoms. They want their story to be understood. Consider what happened to get me to this point, they might let's say. They'd like to see a strengths and focus and a recovery focus and consideration of spirituality. Spirituality is often thought of as, in relation to religion and immaterial things, but I'd put it to you, perhaps following from William James, he thought that the religious attitude for any person was their total reaction upon life. Janet thought that a higher function involved a coordination of the mind. And I'd suggest that when we talk of the spirit, we're talking about something real and felt, not something that's immaterial and of another world. And of course, in STARTS, you would be very familiar with the importance of culture and the impact of displacement, of losing one's connections with culture. Another part of our biology that Jaak Panksepp recognizes is the seeking system. This is an effective system that we share with all animals, all living organisms. All organisms seek what they need from the environment. A difference with humans is that we have both a physical environment and a symbolic environment because of the endowment of language. This complicates life in some ways, but also provides the possibility of finding ways throughout life. I was speaking to Stephen Porges last year, and he contrasted his life at this stage when he can still explore, even though he's not as physically capable as he once was. He also mentioned the sense of purpose and how it's a kind of, he thinks of it as being the opposite of trauma. And the example I gave with Roosevelt might give you an idea of what's meant. It's actually not unusual that people find their way by devoting themselves to doing something about the situation that has caused them problems in the first place. I've also mentioned the importance of consumer groups. This coming out phenomenon that I refer to here is an important political movement, I think, and has changed the way we look at things. And it can be seen in a whole lot of groups within our society. On the one, I think on the whole, a humanistic view would be supporting of diversity and encouraging people to become who they feel they're meant to be. Part of this process is the need for recognition, and the need for recognition of suffering is central to that. This man will be familiar to some of you. It's Donald Winnicott. Winnicott, I think, more than any other psychoanalyst, was important in changing the emphasis from a drive internally based model to recognizing the influence of the environment, and also recognizing the importance of play. We often talk about attachment and the importance of attachment, but for infants to develop to their potential, they need to be involved in a field of play. And certainly in the conversational model, we think play is an important metaphor for therapy, as did Winnicott. Now, this next quote might be a bit controversial. It's probably not very PC these days, but I found it recently in an article taken from Winnicott. So he says, rape and being eaten by cannibals, these are mere bagatelles as compared with violation of the self's core, the alterations of the self's central elements by communication seeping through the defenses. This is a sin against the self. Now, I don't think he's really trying to understate the significance and severity of terrible crimes, but he is trying to highlight the importance of early development. And really, since Winnicott, our knowledge of this early period of life is much greater. And I think increasingly we do understand just how influential it is. I've taken this little example from a novel I read recently, so there's no issues of confidentiality here, but a child's born, product of an abusive relationship, between a stepfather and his adolescent stepdaughter. The man wants to kill the child at birth. The mother, stepdaughter, pleads for the child to be spared, shielding the infant. The child lives, but the abuse continues. The infant's mother escapes the home to escape the violence, leaving the child in the care of an ineffectual mother and her abusive partner who treats the child sadistically. Not surprisingly, the symptoms, bedwetting, but these are punished. If one just thinks of that kind of environment and what's being communicated, I think it's amazing that the child survived at all. And in early trauma, I think the mind is born into darkness and pain. There may be some ray of light somewhere, but it's clearly a huge struggle to adapt. This article by Benedetto Farina and colleagues, is a useful one, I think, so I'd recommend it to you. It's in the list of references at the end. Whether traumatic attachments, it contributes to many disorders. When it's severe, it typically complicates the picture and worsens the prognosis. They argue that we should think of this as a traumatic dissociative dimension that should be considered in all clinical presentations. An important point that he makes is neglect being the major form of developmental trauma. Again, that's not automatically what people think of. Of course, there are many other forms, and the positive, you might say, acts of commission, the sexual abuse and physical abuse and even emotional abuse stand out, I guess. But neglect, the failure of response, if you think of the still face experiment, which most of you will be familiar with, it has a profound effect. And if this is compounded over a significant period, the effect can be extremely severe, to the point of the infant failing to thrive and dying. So quite a lot of children grow in situations where there is a cumulative burden of trauma. One might think of this cumulative developmental trauma as a useful term. When the source of protection is also the source of threat, and the child is powerless, there's a disintegration, a disaggregation, compartmentalization, one might say, of the child's mind as it develops, which diminishes, of course, their overall effectiveness in some ways. Farina and co argue that disorganized attachment isn't really an individual level clinical diagnosis, so he prefers the term attachment trauma. So when we're faced with inescapable threat and conflicting and simultaneous activation of attachment and survival defense systems by autonomic, unconscious responses, a sense of meaning is mucked around with. They can't be assimilated into the same framework of meaning. There's no possibility of a single synthesis. And of course, this makes therapy more difficult, including the establishment of safety and trust in the therapeutic relationship. I think most of you will be familiar with the ACEs study. I think it's significant that neglect wasn't included in that, but nevertheless, it's good evidence of the impact of adverse experience in childhood. And importantly, I think not only in relation to mental health and a lot of disorders apart from the specific PTSD and CPTSD diagnoses, but also physical disorders of various kinds that are familiar to us and common. So it's a hidden epidemic. This phrase is used quite a lot these days. And not surprisingly, there's global dysfunction and decreased participation in life. That achievement of a worldview that binds things together is chopped up and not possible in this situation. So I come back to the idea of stories, and when we think of the situation of severe neglect, I had an experience working overseas with someone that died from failure to thrive, essentially. This was a young girl who was about the size of a 15-month-old child, although she was 5. No name, although they gave her one in the hospital. No visitors. In a way, the life had never happened. There was no story. It's an extremely sad situation. I find, although I don't remember the name that she didn't really have anyway, but I do still see her. So something's missing there, isn't it? And it may not be compatible with life. Other forms of traumatic story may just barely be compatible with life. So in the script, the person is constantly having to adapt to trauma. There's no chance for personal growth because they're constantly reacting. There's little story otherwise. They don't feel safe to change either. So there's pretty much no story. I mean, there might be a basic script like haven't got the message that I'm stupid or I'm bad or something like that. It doesn't really constitute a story. Under other circumstances of chronic stress, possibly somewhat similar to the situation you're going to hear with Tiana's patient, psychological isolation is a common outcome. The child might feel everything is up to them and that their story can only continue, their existence can only continue if they're constantly busy. So this will be reflected clinically in recitations of events and facts without the colour of personal experience. I can see that I'm going over time, so I probably should try and move along a bit. I won't dwell on these. I've touched on some points here before. You know, the opposite of dissociation is reassociation, which implies relationship and implies creating something together. The idea of post-traumatic growth is a hopeful one, and sometimes people do actually reinvest in life and grow. I think we can't fix trauma, but we can understand and we can expand someone's frame of reference, and they often can employ a path of healing, can follow a path of healing. The idea of allostasis is one where when we think about social engagement and social regulation, that's what helps us grow. In these exchanges which involve regulation, it's not just about staying the same, it's about growth. So whilst we can make many diagnoses and current classifications lend themselves to multiple diagnoses, from the patient's perspective, it's usually one condition that they're seeking help for. I think reaching an agreement with patients about specific symptom clusters that might be addressed in different ways is a useful approach to take. I'd like to see multidisciplinary teams being involved. The structure of the health service doesn't always support that, although organisations like STARTS probably are well positioned. Pharmacological interventions can be very helpful, I think, but they're used, I think, as in general psychiatric practice, but they're targeted towards specific symptom clusters and shouldn't be seen as curative. They're adjunctive treatments. Validation of experience is crucial, recognition, and helping create a sense of purpose and future. And understanding the role of language. People often talk these days about talking treatments not being central to the treatment of trauma. There's a lot of other interventions that can be very helpful, but unless they're in the context of a trusting relationship that is seeking to understand the person, I don't think they will be effective. Sorry to have gone over time. I will finish there. Thank you.